hear from the Human Rights Watch team about this. Um, Let me give you a quick set of introductions. At the center is Elaine Pearson. She is the Asia Director of Human Rights Watch. On her right is Manashi Ganguly. She is the Deputy Asia Director. She's in charge of South Asia. And then to my immediate right, Sunai Pasok, who's the senior researcher for Thailand and is well known to many people in the club. So, but before we start talking about these issues, we're actually going to see a video. So I'd like to ask that the video be run.
Governments around the world were tested in 2024, from heightened repression in Russia, India, and Venezuela to catastrophic armed conflicts in Gaza, Sudan, and Ukraine. Many governments have failed to protect human rights around the world. Even governments that advocate for human rights often overlooked abuses committed by their allies, allowing oppressive leaders off the hook. But this isn't a moment to step back. It's a moment for governments to fight and defend universal human rights and for people and civil society to hold them accountable. 2024 was marked by abusive armed conflicts and humanitarian crises. In Haiti, criminal groups coordinated large-scale attacks, killing thousands of people, recruiting children, and committing sexual violence against women and girls. In Gaza, Israeli authorities have committed ongoing unlawful attacks on Palestinians and deliberately deprived them of access to water, which is essential for human survival. The conflict in Sudan between the Sudanese armed forces and rapid support forces has resulted in widespread atrocities, including mass killings, sexual violence, and forced displacement. And in Ukraine, Russia continued its large-scale attacks on the country's energy grid, hospitals, and other infrastructure, killing and injuring many civilians. But against all odds, there were still those who dared to stand up for rights and resist oppression. In Bangladesh, student protests led to the resignation of long-time repressive leader Sheikh Hasina, and there is now an interim government in place that has promised reform. In South Korea, thousands took to the streets to protest President Yoon Suk-yeol's declaration of martial law, which the National Assembly overturned 6 hours later. The past year has also shown us what's possible when governments display bold leadership to protect human rights and bring justice. Sierra Leone and the Dominican Republic joined Luxembourg to champion a new treaty to strengthen the right to education to ensure free schooling at the pre-primary and secondary level of all children. And South Africa's case before the International Court of Justice alleging that Israel violated the Genocide Convention in Gaza led to multiple orders and increasing international pressure to protect civilians in Gaza. The uncertainties we face in 2025 and beyond to protect and uphold human rights will require persistence, conviction, and imagination. It will call for governments and leaders to resist efforts to roll back established human rights law and practices, and to protect the vital role of rights defenders and civil society groups working to protect those at greatest risk. When rights are protected, humanity flourishes. When they're denied, the cost is measured not in abstract principles, but in human lives. This is the challenge and the opportunity of our time.
So this is the actual report that is being released today. It's quite weighty, and in the interest of conserving paper, it's available online at HRW.org. You can download it as a PDF. You can also download individual chapters. So very important. And Oh, yeah, and also there's a QR code here as well. So let's get into the meat of this issues and what's happening here. I'm going to actually take the moderator's prerogative and ask a few questions to start. Then we'll later get to question and answer. I should also mention that this is live on Zoom. People can leave questions in the Zoom chat that's being monitored. It's also live on the Facebook page of the Foreign Correspondent Club of Thailand. People can also leave questions there for the panelists, and we will get to those in the question and answer period. But to start, I want to ask Elaine, what is new and different in this year's World Report for Asia, and are there any bright spots?
Yeah, thanks so much, Bill. And I also want to acknowledge and thank you for hosting this event. Obviously, you've been, a long-term staff member previously at Human Rights Watch, and we really appreciate working closely with you in your new role here at the FCCT. So, yes, we're here to launch this report, which is the 35th time that Human Rights Watch has issued the World Report. And often I'm sitting here and reciting a long litany of human rights violations that have taken place across the region. But I do want to start today actually talking about some of the bright spots that we've seen. And in 2024, it really was an extraordinary year for people power movements across Asia. Let me give some examples. South Korea, the fact that President Yoon tried to impose martial law, which would have resulted in sweeping restrictions on human rights in South Korea. That was overturned extremely quickly because South Koreans got up in the middle of the freezing night and thousands of them swarmed the National Assembly. Parliamentarians voted to rescind it. Within hours, the order was rescinded. Within days, he was impeached. And just this week, he's been arrested. So yes, it was longer and messier than I think a lot of South Koreans would have liked, but overall, the checks and balances have worked to prevent this abuse of power. Bangladesh is another critical example. In Bangladesh, we saw in August student-led protests that quickly morphed into a nationwide movement, which was successful in ousting Sheikh Hasina after 15 years of abusive rule and even manipulating the last election in order to maintain that power. And now we see an interim government that is trying to chart a rights-respecting future. And you'll hear more about Bangladesh from my colleague, Meenakshi. And then Sri Lanka. I mean, Sri Lanka was one of the many countries in 2024 that had elections. And the voters turned away from the existing political parties. They voted for change. They wanted something new because they were sick of the economic mismanagement. They were sick of the corruption, the lack of accountability for the serious abuses during the conflict. And so they voted for change. And I think we saw that reflected in, numerous elections around the region. And finally, just a couple of points that even in the non-democracies in Asia, we see people taking extraordinary risks in 2024 to stand up for human rights. Myanmar, just across the border, nearly 4 years since the coup, and people are still taking extraordinary risks to resist the junta, despite extrajudicial killings, disappearances, arbitrary arrests. And we'll talk more about Myanmar a bit later. Afghanistan, the Taliban has increasingly tried to systematically erase the rights of women, rights that many women around the world just simply take for granted. And yet we see Afghan women still taking to the streets, protesting and demanding their rights. So for me, that's really the good news story of the past year.
Well, and what are some of the other overall trends you're seeing, Elaine, across the region? I mean, what are the sort of things that have really sort of grasped the attention of Human Rights Watch this year?
Well, I mean, I think the sort of democratic backsliding, the weakening of democratic institutions, the fact that, in countries from, Pakistan to Cambodia, we've seen political opponents hounded into exile, imprisoned. Here in Thailand, obviously you had the Move Forward Party dissolved by the Constitutional Court. Civil society is really under siege everywhere. I think about Hong Kong and the mass trial and the sentencing that occurred, in November, where people were sentenced to very heavy penalties, simply for peacefully exercising their rights to free expression. And Hong Kong is just a shadow of its former self. in Hong Kong, we also saw the introduction of a new national security ordinance last year that even increases the penalties and broadens the terms for things like sedition, so that, you know, people are getting punished just for organizing a commemoration of Tiananmen Square, you know, something that years ago, thousands of people would have been joining in Victoria Park. And now, you know, if you risk to even, you know, talk about it or even signal June 4 in Chinese, you could be arrested by the police. And that is happening in Hong Kong. So China, you know, we've seen heightened repression under Xi Jinping in the past year. This year was also 2 years since the UN Human Rights Office issued its report saying that crimes against humanity may be being committed in Xinjiang. Still, we see hundreds of thousands of people who've been detained in prisons in Xinjiang or in re-education camps. And that situation hasn't improved. And I hope at some point we can also talk about the situation of the Uyghurs here in Thailand. Maybe just one final point on transnational repression.
Yes.
Because that is an issue that we flagged a year ago when we were here. But in the last year, things have really deteriorated. And, you know, here in Thailand, we had the killing of a Cambodian opposition MP just last week in downtown Bangkok, daylight hours, crowded street. The gunman shot him, you know, point blank dead in front of CCTV footage. Yes, we've seen efforts by the Thai authorities to issue arrest warrants and take people into custody. But the more that we find out about this case, the more it points to people who are linked to the ruling party. And there is a long history of transnational repression in this region involving governments, you know, effectively trading dissidents in an effort to silence them. So why is it that this killing took place in Bangkok and not in Cambodia? It is really a message to dissidents that you might think that you've left your home country, but you aren't safe. We will hunt you down and we will take extreme measures to silence you. And I think this is something that we're very concerned about as a growing trend in this region.
Let me ask Manashi a question here. What we've seen, I mean, obviously we heard the news about Bangladesh and what has changed over there, and I think people would be very interested in your impressions on that. But what we've seen often is South Asian governments don't really step up very much on promoting human rights. And, you know, there was some hope after the elections in India that the situation might change, but given the increasing repression by the Modi government, you know, what can India be doing to promote human rights in the region? What should it be doing? And what do you see as the big trends in South Asia?
Thank you so much, Bill. I mean, Elaine, and you heard Tiran on the video, we've talked about the rise of sort of illiberal democracies around the world. And part of that is coming from anxieties, public anxieties over economic insecurity, over immigrants, and they play into majoritarian politics. And Modi was a great example of this because he built out a campaign that vilified minorities, and that is how he's stayed in power. There were elections in India in 2024 where it appeared that he may not be as successful with his campaign of wild promises on economic benefits and so on. So he reverted to a hate campaign. So we analyzed 173 of his election speeches, of which in 110, he had made remarks that targeted minorities, particularly Muslims. And this had an immediate effect because what happened was that it served as a dog whistle to his supporters, and they ended up in the first months of his returning to office, 12 Muslim men and 1 Christian woman were killed in mob attacks. So it has an immediate effect. Now, the truth about liberal democracies is that eventually people have to deliver. So we saw 2 cases, one in Sri Lanka and one in Bangladesh. Sri Lanka we spoke about last year, where all of you saw protests that led to both the prime minister and the president, who are both brothers, to resign. And now there is a government that was part of the protest that has come in promising reforms. In Bangladesh, the protest had begun by students over job quotas. It was a protest like any other in Bangladesh and would have been crushed as Sheikh Hasina had crushed numerous protests in the past. But what changed was that people got really angry when the police went and attacked these protesters. They were students, they were just sitting there holding up placards. And that led to a massive opposition to her government. People came out on the streets. And as Elaine said, they were willing to risk their lives. 1,000 people, nearly 1,000 people were killed. Tens of thousands were jailed over the 3 weeks that the protests continued until once again, and actually Sheikh Hasina kept talking about, oh, they're trying to do a Sri Lanka to me, which literally is what happened. In the end, she had to flee to India because, the crowds were too large and even the army could not control these crowds. So authoritarians need to know that there is almost always, they can make promises, but if they keep pressing down, if they keep repressing, if they keep violating human rights, at some point there is going to be pushback. And to the other question that you asked, Phil, about human rights and what India can do. In some ways, we have to understand that the world is much more connected now. However much that we're becoming insular, governments need to recognize that almost everything spills over. So we are finding immigrants coming in. We find the Rohingya on boats going everywhere because that is the situation that we are witnessing. So Asian governments, including India, of course, but others, Japan, Australia, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, all of these governments also need to step up to promote human rights both at home and outside.
Thank you very much for that. Let me now turn to the local, which is Sunai Pasok. We're sitting here in Bangkok, so obviously many people are living what is going on here and I wanted to ask you what the main trends are in the what Human Rights Watch has found for Thailand in 2024.
Thanks, Phil, and good morning to you all. The main trends about human rights situation in Thailand reflect shattering hopes that Thai people expressed a while back in the election. They voted for changes, but their hopes, their aspirations are being taken away. First, the election winning party, the Move Forward Party, which basically won because they represented hopes, they represented changes. But one of the main manifesto regarding reform of the monarchy was considered high treason. And that has since served as the basis of legal and judicial attacks against them, resulting in dissolution of the party, banning of the executive. And as we are presenting our world report today, we were told that the National Counter-Corruption Commission might conclude the investigation against 44 MPs of the Move Forward Party, or we nickname them Orange MPs for the color of the party, that their attempts to amend royal insult law severely violate ethical code for political office holder. That would result, if it reached the court and the court agree with the Counter-Corruption Commission, that would result in a lifetime ban of all these 44 MPs, which means it's like a death sentence for politicians. So it showed that, the agent or political party, the Thai people see them as the agent of change, are now under attack. And that is an ongoing trend. Coming in parallel to that, as I said, the manifesto of this party to reform monarchy is now considered again as a taboo. The taboo was broken with the youth-led democracy uprising in 2020 up until basically until 2021, 2022. People had hope that Thailand would be free. There would be no taboo anymore. But that ceiling is now being not only put back, but pressed down further and harder. That using parliamentary process to propose legal amendment to royal insult law is high treason, resulting in dissolution party and potentially lifetime ban of politician. It is now a climate of fear. The fear that Thai people try so hard to break away from it is now being put back. And you can see that no other political parties in the parliament, no senators, would dare raising issues about monarchy reform again, would dare raising issue about the need to amend problematic draconian royal insult law again. And more to that, the number of political detainees in Thailand continue to grow. It has gone past 1,000 already, and that number keeps increasing by days. People charged with royal insult, charged with sedition, often are denied bail. There are proposals by civil society groups, by human rights groups, that there ought to be amnesty for all politically motivated cases, including royal insult cases. But now no one dare to include royal insult charges as part of the amnesty package. It is a no-no. You cannot talk about it. And these people are left to rot in jail. And we even had last year, one youth leader died in custody. She was detained on royal insult charge. She was on hunger strike, trying to demand the rights to bail for everyone, not just her, not just herself, but other political detainees. She had a heart attack and they left her to die in prison without timely and proper treatment. And I don't have to remind you, there was another political case who was immediately transferred out of prison to work next door police general hospital simply by complaining that he felt sick, compared to someone who was really sick, terminally ill, and was left to die. Let's see what we see double standard back again in action in Thailand. So that's one thing about political trend, political freedom trend. Climate of fear is back. People do not dare to speak as openly as they used to be 3-4 years ago anymore. What is disappointing is the failure of the ruling party. The current Pathongtan government is extension of the previous Seta government. They're still basically the same government. Both of them failed to keep their electoral promises, to initiate political reforms, more importantly, to end the legacy of military rule in Thailand. They failed remarkably. None of their promises to initiate reforms have been put in action. They promised to look for ways to bring political detainees out of prison. That hasn't happened. They talk about amnesty. That hasn't happened. They talk about constitutional reform. That hasn't happened. But this is the same government that actively seek international recognition, including by seeking a seat at the UN Human Rights Council. It's starting this month. The 1st of January is the beginning of Thailand tenure at the UN Human Rights Council. But the Thai government has not lived up to the expectation by improving human rights records of Thailand. Domestically, Elaine talked about transnational repression, which is big. Thailand continue to arrest and send back refugees and asylum seekers to face persecution in foreign countries. More often, it is the relationship between Thailand and Cambodia. Thailand just sent back political refugees who were recognized by UN refugee agencies back to Cambodia. And immediately when they arrive in Cambodia, they face treason charge, very serious charge. Thailand is actually obligated under international law and Thailand's own domestic law that prohibit sending back anyone to face torture and persecution in foreign countries. But that has been totally disregarded. So it shows that, even with the change of government from military rule to the election winning party couldn't form a government. We have a Thai government in power instead. Things hasn't been better in Thailand. It is getting worse. So that is my summation of the trend in Thailand. Feels too bad. It's bad news.
Yes. Well, thank you. I mean, I think that living here as well, I would second a lot of those observations. I mean, we had Cambodian MP shot down. Today's discussions on Twitter about whether 48 Uyghurs will be sent back to China in clear violation of basically every international human rights standard. And supposedly that is now, being discussed by the former prime minister. So, where's the accountability? And, we have, in terms of things getting worse, on Monday, we have a new U.S. president being inaugurated. Donald Trump's going to take charge. As a aside, I'll advertise that the FCCT will have an event that night on the 20th here at the FCCT. People are encouraged to come to hear from various experts about what Trump will mean for U.S., Asia, and the world. But let me ask you, on the very particular focus on human rights, what will Donald Trump mean for U.S. and the world on human rights issues?
Thanks, Bill. Well, look, I mean, we're very concerned about President Trump's commitment to human rights based off what we know from his first term. But the reality is, we will measure him on his actions. But, what we know from the first term, very transactional diplomacy, human rights being seen as something that can be traded away. And, we can already see when the Chinese president Xi Jinping had the meeting with Biden on the fringes of APEC. In that meeting, the Chinese government set out 4 red lines for the US-China relationship. And one of those lines was raising human rights and democracy. Now, that wasn't so much a message for Biden. This was a message for the incoming Trump administration, that human rights are something that can be transactional, they can be not considered. Well, actually, the red line is the committing of human rights violations. It's not raising human rights issues. And I think the first test for the Trump administration will be what happens to the Uyghurs who are here in detention in Thailand. I mean, for more than 10 years, you've had them suffering in inhumane conditions in immigration detention. 5 of them have died because of the poor hygiene, because of the inadequate medical care in detention. So they've already suffered so much. And if you look at what's happened in China in that time, things have gotten actually so much worse. Since 2017, we've seen more than 1 million people held in political re-education camps. And, right now, there's still hundreds of thousands of people who are, held in those camps. The High Commissioner said it may constitute crimes against humanity. So absolutely, they should not be sent back. It was encouraging to see Marco Rubio, who's the incoming Secretary of State, to make a clear comment, but Thailand needs to abide by its own laws. And I mean, Sunai, you heard what Sunai said about the principle of not sending people back where there is a risk that they could face torture. Well, in this case, there is a very significant risk that they would face torture upon return. We know that. And so I think it's also incumbent upon foreign governments to be raising concerns, to be weighing in. We can't just rely on the US government. We need other governments that are concerned about human rights in this region, whether that's Japan, whether that's Australia, New Zealand, European countries, Korea, also to be weighing in with the Thai government. And I mean, the Thai government is taking a seat on the Human Rights Council this year. And this will look very bad, I think, for Thailand if, they acquiesce and send back these Uyghurs.
I would also mention that also in immigration detention is a Montagnard human rights activist, King Badab, who's facing extradition to Vietnam. He's a UNHCR registered refugee, and we also believe that he would face torture if he was sent back to Vietnam as well.
If I may add that.
Please.
The case of Montagnard activists is, in fact, the floodgate that was opened by the Thai court. The Thai court used its review of extradition requests by Vietnamese authority of Queen Badab to overrule legal requirements under the anti-torture, anti-disappearance law of Thailand. That, if the law is followed strictly, Queen Badab must not be sent back to Vietnam, as well as others who face imminent risk of serious risk of danger. But the court in Queen Badab's ruling case ruled that it would be okay to send Queen Badab back. So now he is sitting in detention, waiting for the Thai government to decide. It's a matter of time. It's just a matter of time when he will be sent back to Vietnam. So that set a very dangerous precedent. by the Thai court. So, but we will continue to challenge human rights lawyers, human rights organizations will continue to use international legal obligation and Thailand domestic obligation to challenge against any attempts by the Thai authority to send people back to face danger.
Okay. Now we're going to turn to questions from the audience. This is a press conference, so priority is going to be given to working journalists. There is a microphone in the back. If you wish to ask a question, please state very clearly your name, your affiliation, and who you're directing the question to. Please don't make statements. I don't want to have to cut you off. So the microphone is open. While we're waiting for someone to come up to the mic, I have a couple questions that have come in online. And also, I should mention that you can also raise questions on the Zoom chat as well as on the Facebook chat. You want to please go ahead.
Testing 1, 2. Yeah, thank you. It's Keith Richburg from the Washington Post. Elaine, I'd like to just ask just broadly, and anybody else, I guess, who wants to chime in. Could you talk a little bit about the effort to combat disinformation during 2024, and also what you might expect in the coming year, given that a lot of the media platforms, Facebook, X, are no longer going to fact check. That at the moment, that's confined to the U.S., but we don't know if that'll stay confined. And then secondly, Facebook, supports this huge network of fact checkers all around the world, and particularly here in Asia. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great question. I mean, we're extremely concerned about that because we know the damage that the proliferation of hate speech can do on social media platforms. I think we all remember that in 2017, when there was the ethnic cleansing acts that forced, hundreds of thousands of Rohingya from their homes across the border to Bangladesh, this campaign of hate speech was whipped up on social media. And at that time, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, they invested more in ensuring that their platforms would be clean from hate speech. So now seeing these, latest announcements that, they're not going to invest in fact checkers in the US. I mean, I think, it's also a boon for the authoritarian countries in this region that have been wanting to have more power. We've seen the proliferation of fake news laws in, different countries. I mean, even in Singapore, for instance, we've seen the use of that law to try and shut down reporting that is critical of the government, such as groups that are criticizing death penalty cases in Singapore. So, we've also seen Vietnam introduce a new cybersecurity law, which also, expands the powers of censorship. So this is extremely worrying. And Phil, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, I mean, I think, it's very interesting that you had Facebook that seemed to be at one point sort of taking the lead in protecting, factual information, said it cared about human rights, seems to have walked away from that. That's just an observation. I should also mention that we have in the room 2 Human Rights Watch staff members, including Carlos Conde, our Philippines researcher. So if we have any questions on the Philippines, he can help, as well as Brian E. Lau, who's the Deputy Director for Asia for Southeast Asia. So, and I have a question actually from Zoom. This is from BFM Media in Malaysia. And Joshua asks, how can Malaysia effectively lead the ASEAN chairmanship in 2025 to address pressing human rights concerns within the region? And what specific steps can it take to strengthen ASEAN's commitment to upholding human rights principles? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Suna and I were just talking about this issue before the press conference started. And it was only a few months ago that Anwar had said quite openly that the failure to act, and I'm quoting from him, when a member violating the spirit of ASEAN is a dereliction of our moral duty. And now what we see is that actually, Malaysia has appointed Thaksin Shinawatra as their advisor on ASEAN issues. I think we're really concerned that amongst a number of ASEAN countries, there's really been, a weakness in really addressing the situation in Myanmar. We've seen Thailand undercutting the efforts by ASEAN to hold the junta accountable by setting up their own side meetings, and some of those meetings have actually invited junta officials to participate. So, in terms of what we want to see more cross-border humanitarian aid. We want to see Malaysia supporting efforts for a follow-up UN Security Council resolution that would ensure that there's an arms embargo placed on Myanmar, given the fact that the military has continued its scorched earth tactics, has continued its airstrikes, has targeted, hospitals, IDP camps, schools. And the fact that that, has continued despite the fact that we had a 5-point consensus, agreed some years ago, just shows that, the current approach of ASEAN isn't working and we need something stronger.
I would also add that in the other advisors that we've learned about that Anwar has appointed to advise him on ASEAN are former Prime Minister of Cambodia, Hun Sen, and former Foreign Minister of Singapore, George Yeo. So not a lot of rights respecting advisors there. Question, please.
Yeah, hi. Marwan Mark of Nikkei Asia. Your presentation on Myanmar flags the problem of scorched earth policy that the junta has been pushing through. I'm just curious, in light of what we've witnessed in Gaza, where the Israeli government, was basically enabled to pursue a scorched earth policy supported by the US government and other Western governments. Will it be a problem for human rights organizations, the others, to call for some kind of accountability when the whole paradigm of international human rights law has been buried in the graveyards of Gaza? That's my first question. And my second question is, human rights organizations like yours and other international groups do approach Western embassies to lobby governments that are oppressive in Asia and even in the rest of the global South to exert some kind of pressure. Isn't it a bit silly for these embassies to start lecturing these governments at a time when they have aided and abetted a genocide? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the point you made about the hypocrisy and the double standards, particularly in the UN and various international institutions when it comes to Gaza, is something that we pointed out actually in last year's World Report. That was actually the headline, is that it's not okay for governments to say one thing when it comes to Ukraine and yet have a completely different position when it comes to, war crimes happening in another conflict. As far as Myanmar is concerned, I think, the one thing that has happened in the past 12 months that actually those two places have in common is that the ICC has moved forward on arrest warrants, both for Netanyahu, but also for, in the case of Myanmar, a request for an arrest warrant has been made by the ICC prosecutor for the Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing. And so I think actually there is some effort to use these international mechanisms to hold people accountable where crimes against humanity are being committed. And so, ultimately, those institutions will only be as strong as states, backing them up and ensuring that these principles are applied in a universal manner. And it's extremely problematic. It's terrible that the US is undermining the ICC now by threatening sanctions. And I think other ICC members really need to make it very clear that they will abide by the ICC requests for arrest warrants, whether it is, a leader of Israel or a leader of Myanmar. There are 2 other investigations where we understand, arrest warrants could be issued at some point in either the coming months or year. That's Afghanistan, with regard to the crime of gender persecution, and the Philippines, where there's also an ongoing investigation into the extrajudicial killings in the war on drugs. Do you want to take the... Yeah.
Sure. On the Western lecturing and double standards, we've heard this over and over again with various Asian governments. And the truth is that, yes, the West did uphold the rules-based world order, but partly other governments relied on them to do it. They were the messengers who pushed that message. As we see the Western governments perhaps shrink a bit, we will have to, Asian governments, African governments will have to step up, because eventually the upholding the rules-based world order is something that they need because they do not want chaos. They want growth. They want development. All of these things, they won't have to lift millions out of poverty. All of that requires rules-based orders. So it's easy for governments to say, oh, well, you know, this is hypocrisy. Do not come and lecture us. Fine, we do not lecture them. But what do you stand for? And unfortunately, what we've seen over and over again with these governments, whether they're on the Security Council or the Human Rights Council, they abstain, they vote in a transactional way. And that is just not good enough, because eventually we would expect states to focus on rights because it is in their interest and is their job to do. And therefore, yes, we can hear about Western way, you know, hypocrisy, but it's not going to last, because, okay, the West will step back. What are you going to do? So the G20s and the BRICS and so on that have only been an, you know, sort of an alternate narrative will now have to step up.
Yeah. We have a question actually coming in from Zoom for Elaine. This is from Neti Ha, who's with the Democratic Voice of Burma. The question is, in Myanmar, ethnic armed organizations and the National Unity Government, NUG, are working to establish governance in their controlled territories. What should the leaders integrate into their rules to ensure human rights? And how can rights groups enforce these provisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, especially given that by all accounts, you know, the junta is only controlling, you know, between a quarter, maybe half of the country. So actually these issues about governance and the roles of ethnic armed groups and those who, you know, have responsibility for the areas under their control is extremely important. And they should be ensuring that adherence to international human rights standards, adherence to international humanitarian law, ensuring that there are complaints mechanisms established so that those who are experiencing violations, wherever they occur, and they could be, you know, the violations that are perpetrated by the Myanmar military, but they could also be violations, for instance, perpetrated by the Arakan Army in Rakhine State, which, you know, Human Rights Watch has also documented. It's very important that, you know, at this moment, when, you know, some of these groups are also looking for international legitimacy, that donors and the international community is also ensuring that there is pressure to ensure that human rights standards are being met. And at this point, it's also really important that there's, you know, cross-border aid flowing across the border, because there are really acute humanitarian needs. I mean, I was in Chiang Mai just the other week. I, you know, met with two medics who had been working in a jungle hospital, and they told me about the lack of basic things, you know, medicine, equipment that is needed. The fact that, you know, children are not getting vaccinated, and now we're seeing the results of that. So, you know, we need to look at how we can provide humanitarian aid to those who are living in ethnic controlled areas, given the huge numbers of people who are displaced from their homes.
Okay, please.
My name is Christopher Moore, and my question for the panel is, with the advent of climate change coming, what challenges do you see ahead for the increased pressure on human rights, particularly through drought, extreme weather, where there's going to be a lot of mass migration across borders? These are going to be significant challenges to face, and I would be very curious as to how you perceive the human rights community is reacting and planning to meet these challenges.
So yeah, I can respond. I would say, you know, I've been at Human Rights Watch for 15 years now, and, you know, we started our work in the environmental space some years ago, and it has become, you know, a really critical area of our work. You know, we have 4 goals in our global strategy, and one of them is to address the human rights needs that are related to climate change. And so an important part of this work is actually related to the extent to which environmental defenders and activists are under attack in countries when they are raising these issues or raising the alarm about the problematic impacts of, you know, government projects that has, you know, terrible environmental consequences. In some countries like the Philippines, environmental activists have even wound up dead. So, you know, part of it is ensuring that those activists are not punished or penalized for that work, but it's also about how to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. And in this region, you know, we are seeing those impacts, you know, everywhere, from Pakistan to Bangladesh to Australia with the fires. We've looked at how yeah, the worst impacts can sometimes affect marginalized groups, people with disabilities, older people who may not, get the warnings through, mobile phone networks, for instance, that it's time to evacuate. So this is a huge challenge for us. And then finally, the other area of work that we've been doing is, particularly around deforestation and looking at the responsibilities of governments to address those issues. And, the EU has adopted a few new laws to try and strengthen protection to prevent deforestation or goods that are produced through that, whether it's, timber or palm oil. So I think there's a real opportunity there, and we have work underway looking at these issues further in places like Malaysia and Indonesia, where we see vast tracts of land basically being cleared, Indigenous groups sometimes being pushed off their land in order to make way for these plantations.
Okay, we have a question that has come in via Zoom from Kenji Kawase, who's with Nikkei Asia. He's based in Hong Kong. It's a question about Hong Kong. Can you please comment on the ongoing national security trial of Jimmy Lai? Also, as Donald Trump is coming back to the White House, where he said during his campaign that it was somehow, quote, easy, unquote, to pull Mr. Lai from jail, and it was 100%, he said. Please share what you think will happen to Mr. Lai, as well as Hong Kong's deteriorating situation in the Trump era.
Well, look, I mean, I hope it can be as easy as that for Jimmy Lai's sake. And I mean, I think that's a challenge to Trump, actually, to try and keep him to his word. But, we know what has been the fate of other people who have been prosecuted under the national security law in Hong Kong, and it is not good. Very, very few have been acquitted. Most have been sentenced to lengthy prison terms. And the Hong Kong government has made it very clear that when it comes to Jimmy Lai, that they see his actions as tantamount to, separatism or terrorism. This is extremely alarming, given the actions that Jimmy Lai is accused of are things that honestly are quite ordinary and unremarkable in a robust democracy. Things like talking to foreign governments about human rights problems, discussing things like the need for targeted sanctions on abusive officials who aren't ensuring that there is accountability for human rights violations, or indeed, spreading the message about the problematic impacts of laws. So yes, we're very worried about the situation in Hong Kong. Jimmy Lai, is someone who's been held in solitary confinement for a long period of time. We're worried about his health, and it's extremely important that the US and that other governments make it very clear, including the British government, of course, that the Hong Kong government should not be prosecuting anyone for peaceful acts of free expression, and make it clear that it's important that these people should be released immediately.
Okay, and I have another question online. This is from Prak Nokoriet from Radio Free Asia Khmer Service. So it's a Cambodia question. There are actually two questions. First, when national and international organizations issues reports on human rights, the Cambodian government always rejects them. What should the national and international community do to encourage the Cambodian government to respect human rights? And then second, Royal Thai Police Commissioner Kittirat Panpet said at a press conference on January 15th regarding the results of the investigation into the murder of former CNRP lawmaker Lim Kim Ya that, quote, the confession of the accused, the gunman named Ekalak Penoy, is a personal dispute caused by personal anger, unquote. Do you think this murder ended with only the 4 Cambodian Thai suspects, or could there be others behind this case?
So I think with respect to the first question was about
basically the Cambodian government rejecting all accusations that it's violating human rights. What, which would be shocking. Why would they do that?
A few countries in this region that has actually signed and ratified a whole bunch of human rights treaties. Yeah. And so the government is obliged to follow those treaties. And yet, repeatedly, we've seen a crackdown on free expression. We've seen the complete dismantling of independent media in Cambodia, labor activists, opposition politicians, government critics thrown in jail for their actions. And, our reporting is really important, not just, I guess, for the Cambodian government to take note, but we also want foreign governments that have leverage with Cambodia to be asking questions about the Cambodian government, particularly those that are, donor governments, particularly those that have leverage through, funding and training and technical assistance. And then with respect to whether we think it's a personal dispute or, does it go further than that? I mean, the Thai police have already identified, I understand, 3 people in connection with the investigation, the shooter, the spotter, and one other person who I understand has been identified in international media as an advisor of Hun Sen. So, ultimately, the Thai government needs to ensure there is a very thorough investigation that gets to who is the mastermind behind this killing, wherever that may turn. And Suna, I don't know if you want to add anything further.
Right. The Thai police has done exceptionally good job in investigating the assassination of Cambodian former opposition member in Bangkok. But let's not derail their newly earned credits by rushing to conclusion. They should have done a better job. This is a good job, but they could have made it better by following the trail of evidence. Now they could identify someone, as Elaine said, who is known to be connected to Hun Sen as advisor. There's formal document showing the appointment of this person. He has been accused, according to confession, that he paid the gunman to assassinate the Cambodian former opposition MP in Bangkok. The investigation should not just end there. They need to find out more about motives. And mind you, there has all this like identification of perpetrators and complicit in this case, based mainly on confession of the gunman. There has been no investigation on the Cambodian side. And the arrest of the gunman showed that if the 2 sides agree and has willingness to do so, there could be effective collaboration between Thai and Cambodian authorities, as it was shown in like how quickly they could arrest the gunman after he crossed the border from Thailand into Cambodia. He couldn't go that far. He was only in Battambang, not very far from the border at all. So if the 2 sides could maintain that level of collaboration to follow other suspects in this case, we can imagine how much information can be obtained and how deep they can dig it to the depth as to who actually gave the killing order. So I'm not very happy at all with the comments by the Thai National Police Chief, who rushed into conclusion as if to cut off investigation, which seemed to be going well, and now they're going to cut it off as personal dispute. Come on, they could have done better than that.
Okay, we have a question in the back. Please identify yourself.
So my name is Samadhi from Cambodian National Rescue Party. So the first question to Sunai. So right now the government, who is the man who transferred the fund 60,000 baht into the assassin Thai, which is a Thai citizen, they trying to say that he is no longer the advisor to the former prime minister, the current president of the Senate. And the Thai media basically, how can we battle disinformation in this case? Because the Cambodian government is very good in creating disinformations and try to influence Thai media to show that this is more like a motivated a murder case. And the second question is regarding
we have very little time.
Oh, sorry, just a little bit more.
Can we just leave it? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, this show kind of lack of diversified source of information. So Thai media, they are very interested in this case. It was kind of happened in daylight downtown Bangkok, and that area is, where the Supreme Patriarch of Thai Buddhism presides. So it is, in Thai we call it white zone, no violence area. But the assassination was chosen to happen there. So the public interest, the media interest to really know what not happened, but they don't have different sources of information that for human rights organizations such as ourselves, we try to provide alternative sources of information to the Thai media. So they could find out that who are those people on the Cambodian side who have been accused of involving in this case. So if you can provide us whatever information you have, we need to verify that, of course, and then we share it with the Thai media. So this is something that could be done.
Thank you.
Okay. Please go ahead.
My name is Teng Tai U from Voice of America. Going back to Myanmar, now the military junta is preparing to hold the election. They announced in 2025, and including China and some officials from Thailand, they expressed that could be a way to improve the political atmosphere, even though the military junta is losing some territories in Western and Northern. And how do you agree with the regional countries, and how do you think, how do you see the diplomatic approach by the China and Thailand holding the informal talk and trying to help Myanmar situation? Thank you.
Right. Well, this appear to be, attempts to distract from the dire situation in the country, that human rights violation is going nonstop. Crimes against humanity, humanitarian crisis continue nonstop in Myanmar. So by promising that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, there is not even a tunnel. But too bad now we had this kind of concerted efforts by supporters of the Myanmar military regime, the SSC, the countries such as mainly China and Thailand are now becoming cheerleader of the promise of an election as a solution without preconditions on the ground. How can this election can be inclusive? Can it be participatory, free and fair, and genuinely democratic? None of those requirements cannot be checked at all. And we had questions earlier about the role of Malaysia as incoming ASEAN chairman. It is disappointing that Malaysia, that used to be very rare voice of reason within ASEAN, to balance the voice of Thailand, Cambodia, and ASEAN that support the SSE with the support of Myanmar junta. Malaysia is now under Anwar seem to be shifting its stand into seeking some kind of credit from not missing this train of the promise of election in Myanmar. Appointing Thaksin Shinawatra is a bad sign. Has Anwar subscribed to the idea of supporting Myanmar election already? That is something that needs to come out from Anwar's own mouth, that where he is standing, where he is leading ASEAN when Malaysia takes chairmanship. But if Malaysia has dropped its position as balancing voice in ASEAN, I'm very much afraid that the international community will have to face with this kind of distraction game. But more to that is the suffering, the plight of people in Myanmar will continue because of this election, the guise of election.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I mean, these elections have zero legitimacy. I mean, how can we even be talking about elections when, Aung San Suu Kyi is still in jail? I mean, Julie Bishop, the special envoy on Myanmar, cannot even visit her when she made her visit and she met Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing. Political parties are not able to organize. You have, thousands of people who are sitting in jail for their efforts to oppose the junta. So, I think this is short-sighted. I think governments, as Sunai said, they are fatigued in this region, and they think somehow, maybe if we have elections, we can turn the page. But, we can't turn the page when the military is still committing these scorched earth tactics, and we're seeing airstrikes that are, killing so many civilians on a regular basis.
Thank you very much.
So we have a couple more questions here, but I'm conscious of the fact that we're running over time. I want to note that on the 23rd of January, Thailand will put in effect the same-sex marriage law, LGBT rights. which is a big step forward. And there's a question from Poromet from the Bangkok Post, said, as Malaysia has become this year's ASEAN chair, how would you suggest Malaysia and ASEAN members discuss the LGBTQ rights in the region, as this group's issues have never been raised at the table at ASEAN due to so-called sensitivity?
Great question. And I think given as of next week, Thailand is passing the marriage equality law, it would be fantastic for the Thai government to be pushing Malaysia to put this issue on the agenda. But obviously we know within ASEAN, there is huge, differences in how LGBT rights issues are dealt with. In a number of countries, same-sex relations are still criminalized. Malaysia itself, we've actually seen, and I think we mentioned this in the World Report, continued crackdown on LGBT people and, their efforts to try and recognize not just marriage equality, but also to fight for their rights.
We have a question from East Asia, actually. Questions about North Korea. North Korea is in the news with its soldiers deployed in the Russian military and its war in Ukraine. What are your concerns on human rights connected to the growing relationship between Russia and North Korea?
Well, North Korea is, probably the world's most repressive country. And, frankly, it's really irritating to see that it's now in the news again for what's happening in Europe, not for the horrible atrocities that are happening by Kim Jong-un to the ordinary people in North Korea. I mean, 10 years ago, we had a Commission of Inquiry report that found that these litany of abuses constituted crimes against humanity. And frankly, this is what happens when the international community fails to hold a repressive regime like North Korea accountable. We're now seeing this cozy relationship between Russia and North Korea, where the two countries are now bound to, defend one another. The conflict is escalating in Russia and Ukraine. We're seeing POWs just this last week being picked up by Ukrainian forces. It's important that Ukrainian forces apply the Geneva Conventions. And frankly, we're worried about what would happen to those people if they are returned home to North Korea, given their, faces have been shown on international media. One of them has actually said that they would like to remain in Ukraine. And this is a regime that engages in collective punishment. So, I think a lot of questions remain to be answered, but, North Korea actually should be the top of the list of priorities for a lot of governments.
Okay.
Hello, Jérémy André, working for Le Point magazine from France. So I've been discussing with people in France about the assassination of Lim Kim-ya, and many among officials are jumping on the conclusion that they have undisputable evidence that this is not a political assassination, thanks to all the information provided by the state media here. So, have you seen any sign of action by France to request for investigation and accountability on this? And what do you think of their action?
I mean, I think I saw a statement from the embassy here initially saying that the French government was concerned about this and that they would be closely monitoring the Thai investigation. But frankly, I think, this needs to be escalated. The fact that, a French citizen, someone who I understand was a former civil servant in France, has been killed in downtown Bangkok in this way, demands answers. And I think, France's leaders actually should be raising this at the highest levels with Thailand's government to ensure there is a full, thorough investigation. As Sunai said, certainly the Thai authorities have responded quite quickly. But, we need to make sure that, once the pressure and the initial media reporting subsides from this case, that there is real follow-up.
Thank you.
Okay. We have two last questions online. They're two very different questions. The first question actually from Kenji Kawase about the earthquake in Tibet. Can you please share your observation of the situation after the quake, including on the human rights situation, which is already quite bad in Tibet? And then from Kobe Hobbs, the editor at Cambodia, one of the last independent media outlets in Cambodia that are still standing. Traditionally, human rights abuses in Cambodia were largely domestic, and many concerned governments remained ambivalent. However, these abuses are increasingly transnational, including documented repression across ASEAN borders, the recent murder of the Cambodian French dissident, billions lost by U.S. citizens to Cambodia-based cyber scams, an industry that also traffics in over 100,000 victims from 60-plus countries. Given this expanded crisis, how have Cambodia's human rights abuses destabilized the region and beyond, and what actions might concerned governments and stakeholders take to address them? And I would also add that it's not just Cambodia where the scam centers are operating, but we have major scam centers operating in Laos, also in all along the Myanmar border. And there have been various different information that has come out implicating people in Thailand connected to some of these scam centers. So I guess a larger question about the scam centers in addition to the Cambodian context.
Okay. On the Cambodia side, I might ask Bryony to help me, but I'll answer first the question on Tibet and the earthquake, because, you know, it's gotten increasingly difficult to gather information about what is happening in Tibet, precisely because not only is it impossible for, very difficult for Tibetans to leave the province, but also the Chinese government has detained people for having contact with people outside the region, people who are contacting family members or trying to alert them to what is going on. And what we've seen, you know, so far is that, you know, often when, you know, a crisis or a disaster like this happens, the Chinese government is very quick to censor information about what's really happening on the ground, because they want a very careful, manufactured response showing how the Chinese government is doing the right thing and, you know, helping people. But we don't know how many people have been affected. We don't know how many casualties. We also don't know what the gaps are. And what we've seen in the past is, you know, certainly with the outbreak of COVID, I mean, the Chinese government actually tried to crack down on whistleblowers like the doctor who was the first to raise the alarm about COVID. So, you know, I'm really worried, and it's really difficult to know exactly what's happening in Tibet, particularly because of these efforts to penalize those who are sharing information with others about what is happening there.
Okay, and now we'll hear from Bryony Lau, who's the Deputy Asia Director and in charge of Southeast Asia.
Thanks, Phil. And thanks for the question on Cambodia. So regarding the scam centers, I mean, obviously the scam centers are one of the most pressing regional crises that Southeast Asia is facing. And the fact that Cambodia, the problem started in Cambodia and it's now spread to affect parts of Myanmar as well, especially in the border areas, this really shows that a much stronger response is needed from the region. But in particular, what's needed is not just a response that looks at this issue from the perspective of it being criminal activity and as a law enforcement problem. It's also a massive human rights problem. And we know for certain that there's hundreds of thousands of people who are affected by these scam centers, and that the response to the scam centers also needs to take into account the rights of victims who are being forced into committing criminality. I do think we have seen some response to Cambodia's enablement of the scam centers. So last year, we did see the US government sanction Lee Yong-pat, who owns a number of the compounds. That's a positive step. And certainly other governments that are concerned about scams in the region should consider other ways that they could take actions like this to send a signal that, that the problem is huge and it needs to be addressed. Just more broadly, in terms of this question that's come up a couple of times regarding how can concerned actors try to influence the Cambodian government's disregard for human rights. I think one thing that's really important that we haven't talked about so much today is also what the private sector can do. Certainly since we saw the transition of power in Cambodia to Prime Minister Hun Manet, the government has been very actively trying to court new foreign investment from a range of different countries. And this is where business actors can definitely be saying to Cambodian government leaders who are trying to attract their investment that they're worried about the human rights situation, that they might be operating in jurisdictions like the EU, where companies are increasingly expected to ensure that their supply chains are not tainted by human rights abuse. So there's certainly a range of different responses that could be used to address the human rights problems in Cambodia. And we encourage, private sector actors, in addition to governments, to consider what they could do to try to address these very serious issues.
Okay, thank you very much. So that wraps up the press conference for today. I want to thank the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand for serving as the venue. I want to thank Human Rights Watch and the Asia team for coming here and for holding their event here. Obviously, the team will be here after the press conference ends, so you have specific questions for them. You can come up. If you want to conduct a one-on-one interview with any of the members, you can certainly do so. But for now, thank you again for coming to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, and we'll see you at a future event. Thank you.